So let's get started here with this blending modes part 2 webinar. And let's just start out with talking about what blending modes are. So blending modes, they determine how two layers, or a photo with an adjustment or a photo with a filter, how those two pieces of things combine and blend together. So with blending modes, there's a lot of math and technical things that go into them. So with this webinar, we're going to break it down to kind of the foundational thought of blending modes. And I think that'll make it a lot easier to understand. So let's start out here with this little chart of all of these blending modes. So at the top here, we have normal and dissolve, which normal is just going to basically be what the image is. And then we have the darken modes below those two. Below that, we have the lighten modes, and then we have the contrast modes, and then we have comparative modes and composite modes. So the main ones we're going to be talking about or using are going to be these darken modes, the lighten modes, and the contrast modes. However, sometimes we do use these other modes, but more often than not, we're going to be staying in these three categories here. So that brings me on to my 5 probably most used blending modes. And if you attended the last webinar, we talked about these pretty in-depthly. And we'll go through them today a little bit more, but we're going to just kind of use it as a refresher. So the 5 most used or commonly used blending modes, and this could be debated, but I would say they're multiply, screen, overlay, color, and then luminosity. So the first blending mode that we're going to talk about is multiply. And multiply is probably one of the most commonly used blending modes out there, and it really helps you create a darkened look on your photo. So with the multiply blending mode, to get in kind of the technical aspect of it, it combines the contrast and the luminosity of the top and bottom layer together. And when it does that, it makes for a darkening look on your photo. So to make that a little bit more easier to understand, let's actually go into Photo Raw and let's start playing with the blending mode on an actual photo. So let's start with this photo here. So I'm just going to pull up my film strip view mode real quick, and I'm going to grab this kind of little grayscale thing. And this really helps kind of explain blending modes better than I can. So you'll notice in here with this layer, I have complete white, I have 50% kind of opacity black, this nice in-between gray, and then I have 100% black. So if I go over here to this grayscale layer, I can access my blending modes by clicking on this gear icon right here. So to explain a little bit better about multiply, let's just click multiply. So you'll notice that with the white area over here, it's not doing anything because it's all white, so it's not going to darken anything on the photo. But you'll see inside here, oops, there we go. So you'll see inside this middle area where it's 50% gray, or that 50% in the middle between white and black gray, it's darkening whatever it lays onto. And so if I go over to the opacity of that and I lower the opacity, even by lowering that opacity and removing some of that dark black, it's still darkening whatever it goes on top of. So even if you have gray at 2%, it's still going to act as a darkener on top of your photo. Now what I like to use multiply for is either I'm using a vignette to kind of darken around my edges and I want it to darken even more, or you can use it to make your local adjustments just a little bit darker. So I'm just going to hide this grayscale, or actually just delete this layer here. And one thing I like to do, like I was saying, is I like to use it for vignettes. So I'm going to add a filter here, and I'll just add a vignette. And we'll just use Big Softy. So now we have a nice kind of dark vignette. But if we wanted a little bit darker, and I kind of want to tone down this photo as a whole, I can go to my vignette blending options here. If I click on it, I go to my mode, and I go to multiply. Now it's going to darken that area. So now it's darkening this filter, and it's applying this everywhere in my photo to darken it up a little bit. And so I can always play with the opacity and make that a little less dark. But now if I turn this off and on here, see how it does an awesome job of just pulling away a lot of those highlights, bringing in that nice vignette around these corners, and also just kind of darkening the photo as a whole and making it a little bit more moody. So that's kind of just the basics of multiply. I mean, it darkens your photo. So whatever filter or adjustment you have, so if I add even a sunshine filter, and I go in here and I click multiply, see how it's even brighter right now? Well, if I go over and I click multiply, it's going to darken it. So now let's go back. Okay, so now we'll move on to screen. So what you're doing there is you're basically telling Photo Raw, take this top layer or adjustment and brighten it up a little bit on top of my photo. So screen is always going to lighten your image, where multiply is always going to darken your photo. So with screen here, one thing I like to do with screen is I'll do the exact opposite and I'll use it with white vignettes. If we add a filter, I'll add a vignette, and I'll use this white vignette here. So if I go in here to this white vignette, I can access my blending modes again with this gear option. Now if I go into my mode here and I go up to screen, see how it brightens it up? Oops. If we don't want color dodge, that's pretty intense. But see, as we click screen, it really brightens it up entirely. So what I can do now that I have this area that's really bright is I can create a really, really easy kind of light and airy portrait. So now I'll just grab my masking brush by hitting B on my keyboard. And if I lower the opacity for this masking brush to about 20 or so, I can just kind of brush this out where I don't want it around her face. We could even raise it up even more. Let's just go 100. There we go. So now if I turn this vignette off and on, we've created a really kind of high-key, light and airy portrait by using that screen mode. So anytime you use the screen mode, you're always going to be lightening whatever you're putting on top of the photo. And I can always play with the opacity and make it less or more natural. But it's kind of hard to show off these blending modes sometimes when it's not just really showing the effect. So I'm sorry if it looks a little unnatural. I'm probably just trying to show off the blending mode. So that's a great way, especially if you're working with dark areas on your photo. Screen is a really good blending mode to just kind of give it a little bit more brightness. Okay, so let's move on here. And we'll go to overlay. And overlay boosts contrast. So when thinking about overlay, just think about it as it's going to boost the contrast to whatever you're putting on top of. So if I'm using overlay, one thing I like to use it for, and a lot of people use it for, is actually correcting old photos. So if we go back to Photo Raw, if I hit F on my keyboard, let's go grab an old kind of family picture here. And so now with this old family portrait, what I can do, oops, let's pull on that grayscale thing so I can explain this a little more. Okay, so make this a little bit bigger here. All right, so now if I go to my grayscale and I choose the blending mode overlay, you'll see that even with that white right there, it's still creating contrast. So overlay adds in contrast. So I'm just going to delete this one real quick. And so whenever adding in contrast quickly, sometimes I'll just go in, I'll add a local adjustment layer, and let's just click darken, and then I'll invert this so it's applied. And now if I go up to my blending mode here, I can go down to overlay, and now if I play with the opacity of this, I can really add in some nice contrast to an old photo to bring it to life a bit and tone down some of those blown out highlights. So now if I turn this off and on, see how it's really helping this photo bring in some contrast and make it look like it was when it was shot? And that's all because of this overlay blending mode. It's just going to create contrast within whatever layer you're applying to. Normal, overlay. So normal, less contrast, blending mode, overlay, a lot more contrast. Okay, so now let's move on here to the next one. And the next one is color. And color is one of my favorite blending modes because it really allows you to access kind of dark, deep, rich tones of color without modifying the contrast or tonalities of anywhere else in your shot. So let's go back to Photo Raw here, and let's grab this photo. One thing I really like to do, and I'm pretty sure if you've watched some of my webinars or my videos, you've seen me do this a lot, but I'll go into Effects, I'll add a filter, and I'll add the Curves filter. And if you're not familiar with the tone curve, we're probably not going to get into the tone curve today, but just real quick, one thing I like to do is I'll go in here and I'll pull down on my shadows, and I'll pull up on my midtones a little bit. And what I'm doing here is I'm kind of trying to incorporate dark, rich tones into the photograph. But by doing this, obviously I'm toning down this photograph. I'm adding in too much contrast. The shadow tones are all dark. There's a lot of true black. It's messy. But there's a thing that can save us, and that is our color blending mode. So if we go over to our curves filter here, one thing I like to do now that I've brought in that kind of deep, rich tonalities is I'll go to my blending options here, and if I go down to mode, watch as I click color. It took away all that contrast, but if I zoom in here, and I turn this off and on, it's boosting the color really easily, but it's not applying that anywhere on the tonalities, and it's not adding any contrast into the photo. So now in this curves filter here, I can actually play with the tonalities. Actually, we'll zoom out real quick. But watch as I play with these shadow tones to bring in richer or not so rich tones of color. And I can even move my midtones down. But now if I turn this off and on, it does a good job of bringing in more color, more saturation into this photo without actually modifying the tonalities. And I can also do that by playing with my RGB values. So if I want to bring in more red, let's say to the highlights, I could bring in more red to the highlights, pinken those up. And then I could modify the blue, bring in more blue to the midtones, but remove it from the shadows. And all while this is protecting all of my tonalities in my photo, and it's strictly applying this to the color tones. Here we go. So let's go in here, and we can actually do it with a LUTs filter too. So we'll just use one of these cinematic color grading ones. This one. Okay, so right there. So if we look at this photo, we turn this off and on, we have a ton of tonal contrast in this photo, but it's really bright and I really like the colors. But I only wanted to apply to that color. So let's go to my LUTs, and if I go to my blending options, do mode again, and if I click color, it takes away all that contrast, but if I turn this off and on, it's still applying that nice bright color. But if I go down in here to the contrast slider, if I pull this either way, it's not going to add in any contrast, it's strictly going to modify the color tones. Okay, so now we'll move on from the color blend mode to its best friend, the luminosity blend mode. And this is also one of my all-time favorite blend modes. So this blend mode is affecting the layer and pixels below simply based on brightness levels. So it's not affecting the color whatsoever. I mean, obviously when you're playing with brightness, you're going to be playing with different color tones, but the luminosity blend mode is only going to affect this bottom layer based on the brightness levels of that layer. So it's great for just modifying the tonality of a photo and not the color at all. It only modifies the luminance. So let's go into Photo Raw to give you a better idea. Okay, so inside Photo Raw here, let's go into Effects. I'll add a filter, and we'll add another curves filter, because I feel like this is just a pretty good way of understanding the luminosity and the color blend modes. So inside my curves filter, I'm just going to play with the tone curve, and I'm going to make it quite dark, make it be a little of a kind of a faded look, pull up on the midtones. So look at this shot. If I turn this off and on, really, really incredibly colorful, tons of contrast, really kind of looks muddy. Well, just for the example of showing you guys the luminosity blend mode, let's go over here, and in our gear options, let's go down to mode and watch as I click luminosity. Did you see that? It was really subtle, but let's go back to normal. Look at the color on her face. So I'll go from normal, and now let's do luminosity. Boom. So once you click the luminosity blend mode, whatever you're using as your blend layer, which is this curves filter here, that's telling Photo Raw only affect the luminance or the tonalities in this photo and don't modify any of the color on this shot. So watch as I go into these red and green and blue channels. If I play with these, it's only modifying the tonality of those, and it's not modifying any of the actual color tones. So if I want to go in here and I actually want to modify the blue tones in the background, I can click on this, I can navigate to my shadow tones, and now watch as I can either darken them or I can brighten them up. And it's not actually modifying the color, it's strictly just modifying the tones. So if it went back to normal, you're bringing all of that color in there because I've modified the tone curve and the different colors within it. But by using that luminosity blend mode, we're strictly applying that blend layer to just the luminosity or the tonalities in that photograph. Okay, so now we can go on to part 2. So let's move on here to part 2. And we're going to start with Darken. And Darken is also a pretty common blending mode. So in the Darken blending mode, white is your neutral color. So basically, if the selected layer has white, this will not affect or darken the layers beneath. This makes sense because how would you darken with white? This is just saying that any areas that are darker on that base color will replace the lighter colors on the blend layer. So it's always going to be a darker image. And the darkening blend mode can sound pretty confusing, but it's a lot easier than you think once we start showing this grayscale. So let's go back into Photo Raw. So inside Photo Raw, let's use this photo of Janelle again. And let me actually just pull that grayscale in real quick. Make it pretty big here. There we go. Okay, so let's just take a look at this grayscale before we start talking about the darken blend mode. So if we take a look at here, we have this white, complete white on this left, and then we have 50% gray, and then we have complete black. So if we go back to that darken blend mode here, any areas that are darker on the base color will replace the lighter colors on the blend layer. So any areas that are darker on this picture of Janelle will replace the lighter colors on this blend layer that's on top. So if we go over to this grayscale and we go into our gear icon, let's click darken, and you'll see that the white goes away immediately. Well, that's because nowhere on this photo is lighter than that 100% white. So that white isn't darker than anywhere on this shot, and so it just completely gets removed because it's being replaced by all of these darker tones on that bottom layer. Now in the middle here, we have that 50% gray. So that 50% gray is darker at times than some of these areas on her face, especially these kind of bright highlighted areas on her cheeks in here where the sun's hitting it. So those areas are getting replaced with that 50% gray. But if we take a look at her hair in here, notice how her hair isn't getting changed at all with this blend layer here. And that's because her hair is obviously darker than this 50% gray. But if we take a look at this complete black, obviously this 100% black is darker than this entire photo, so it's replacing the entire shot with its darker color. So let me show you this on a different photo, and it might be a little bit easier to understand. So let's go into this photograph here. And I'm going to drag this one on top of it. And let's make this a little bit smaller. Perfect. Okay, so going back to that darken blend mode, any areas that are darker on the base color will replace the lighter colors on the blend layer. So any areas, if we go back to the our layers in Photo Raw, so this top layer here, actually we'll rename these. We'll just do blend layer and place layer. So if we take a look at this blend layer here, obviously it's a lot lighter in the majority of this photo than if we turn it off and we take a look at this photo. So this base layer here, these palm trees in here are a lot darker. I mean, obviously way darker than any area on this top layer here. Maybe this area up top here and maybe down at the bottom, but for the most part, those palm trees, those kind of silhouetted palm trees in here are all darker than anywhere on this photograph. But if I take a look at this blend layer here, if I turn this blend layer off, notice this area in between these silhouetted trees. This area, these kind of mid-tone areas in here and highlights, these areas are lighter than this photograph here. A lot of the areas on this photograph are darker than the areas between these palm trees. So if I use that darken blend mode here, watch as I go down to darken, you'll see that because these areas in between these palm trees are lighter than the areas on this blend layer, those are getting replaced. But these palm trees in here, because these palm trees are darker than any area on this base layer or this blend layer here with the stars, those are the one that those are showing through. Those aren't getting replaced at all. Those are the ones that are showing through to the final composite. So again, any areas that are darker on the base layer are going to shine through, whereas any areas on that base layer are lighter than any areas on the blend layer. Those areas are going to get replaced. And you can always play with the opacity to make these blend modes a little bit more realistic. Okay, so now we'll move on to soft light. So soft light is an awesome blend mode, and it's similar to overlay, but it won't add as much contrast to your image. So it's kind of just like a mellow overlay blend mode. So technically speaking, every color that is lighter than 50% gray will get even lighter, like it would if you shine a soft spotlight through it. In the same way, every color darker than 50% gray will get even darker. However, it will never reach true black. So that is great for adding in contrast, but not as harshly as overlay. And a couple things I like to use this soft light for is I like to use it when I'm duplicating different layers, because you can use it to bring in some nice contrast and exposure to a photograph. And I'll show you that in a minute. And I also like to use it on reflections for sky replacements. I think it adds in a nice reflection on top of water because it's not as contrasty as overlay, but it still has that nice overlay property. So let's go into Photo Raw. Okay, so let's start with this photograph here. And I brought in this grayscale. Let's turn this on. Okay, so anything lighter than 50% gray is going to lighten, and then anything darker than 50% gray is going to darken. So if we go over to our grayscale JPEG and we go into our blending modes, let's go down to soft light. Perfect. So now if we take a look at this photograph and this JPEG scale here, or this grayscale, you can see that over on the left where we had that white, because that was brighter than 50% gray, that's lightening this area on my photograph. You can see anywhere that this is over, this top blend layer is brightening the base layer because this top layer with this grayscale, this far left area is lighter than 50% gray. But if we take a look at this middle area here where it is 50% gray, it's not affecting this photograph at all. Inside of there, because it is 50% gray, it's not darker than or lighter than, it's not doing anything to the shot. But then if we take a look at this right side of this grayscale, you'll see that the dark, because it was darker than 50% gray, obviously it's black, it's darkening up the photograph. But because it can't reach true black, it's darkening these areas and adding in nice contrast. So let me show you what I like to use it for. And we'll just delete this layer. And one thing I like to use it for is adding in some nice, deep, rich color tones and contrast to photographs whenever I'm shooting product photography. So for this layer, I'm just going to right click and I'll duplicate this layer. And let's go into the blending options for this layer and let's click soft light. So you'll see already that because a lot of these areas in this photograph are darker than 50% gray, it's darkening a lot of these areas. But you'll see that with the areas that are lighter, it's giving them a nice boost of light. So one thing you can do with these two layers now is I'll just rename this blend layer, rename this one base layer. And with this blend layer here, I can modify the different tonalities in this blend layer here, and it can boost up a lot of the colors and vibrance of the shot, and I don't even have to modify anything on this base layer. So watch as I pull up on this exposure here, just to bring in a little bit more light. Some midtones, probably right there, maybe some shadows. There we go. Perfect. Add a little bit of white. There we go, a little highlight boost. Okay, so now if I go up to this blend layer, watch as I turn this off and on. I mean, just look if I zoom into these blueberries here. So that's with the blend layer on top, without. So again, it's just utilizing those light areas to bring in a nice highlight boost, but then it's telling Photo Raw, here, take these dark areas, make it a little bit darker, add in some nice contrast, and you can see how much it richens up the colors and the tones in this photo. And then you can play with the color to add more color, less color. You could cool it down, warm it up a little bit. And you could also brush it out of areas. So if you want to, remove some of this blend layer from areas on this photograph where it's a little too bright, maybe we want to remove a little bit from this lemon so it's not so bright on here. We can lower the opacity a little bit. Whoops. Lower the opacity a little bit. There we go. We'll kind of just tone down that lemon. And voila. Really utilizing that soft light blend mode to bring in a nice bit of contrast and deep rich color. And we've only brought it in just by using a different layer. So now let me show you how I like to use it on quick sky replacements. Okay, so with this particular photo, I'm not going to do a crazy in-depth sky replacement. So don't judge the masking or the refining, but just want to give you guys an idea of how to use the soft light blend mode. So let's bring in a different sky real quick. So let's say we're trying to do a nice sky swap on this photograph. We'll bring this up here like that. Lower the opacity, we'll put that below it. Let's grab my masking brush. So now watch as I go over to the sky, and we'll go to the blend mode and we'll choose soft light. Look how great of a job it does on this water. Just adds in a nice, perfect kind of reflection on the water. And it's not as contrasty as that overlay. So really great for reflections and also using it to kind of boost up deep, rich tones of color. We could go in here and make it a little bit more appealing. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one, which is hue. And hue is an awesome blend mode, and it's really a great way to get creative with color. So creates a result color with the luminance and saturation of the base color and the hue of the blend color. So essentially, the top blend layer set to hue will color the layers below with whatever color you put on the blend layer. That will adjust the color to take on the brightness and saturation of the layers beneath. So what that's saying is that whenever you paint on a blend layer that's set to hue, or you're using a blend layer with hue, it's going to take over the colors underneath with the hue of your blend layer, but it's going to take on the brightness and the saturation of the layers beneath it. So it's going to maintain the saturation and brightness of the same colors, but it's going to be it's going to be that hue color of your blend layer. So what I like to use it for is swapping colors on clothes or in product shots. Really awesome for clothing swaps with portraits. So let me show you guys that real quick. Okay, so using the hue blend mode, let's start in our local adjustments tab here. And I would use the grayscale, but because we're dealing with color, it's not going to do anything. So we'll go into this local adjustment here, and I'll click paint with color. Let's pick a nice just blue, kind of a dark blue. And then let's go over to our adjustment, and we'll choose mode, and we'll go down to hue. So again, with the hue blend mode, the hue of this local adjustment, the hue color, that blue right here, the hue of that color, when we paint this on, is going to replace the color of the base layer. So that's going to replace the colors on this hat here. But it's going to maintain the saturation and brightness of this red color in this hat. So let's zoom in here. Okay, grab my local adjustment brush. And now watch as I paint this on. See how it's dominating that color in the hat and replacing it? So now I can go out, and if I turn this off and on here, just quickly replaces that color really easily. And that's because it's using the hue of this blend layer here, and it's replacing the color of the base layer. So the hue uses the hue of your blend layer, and it replaces the color of your base layer, but it doesn't affect the saturation or the brightness. So let's go out here and let's do another one real quick. Click paint with color, and let's make this a vibrant green. Like that. So now let me show you how it looks if we're not painting it in. So we'll just go up to adjustment, invert this, and we'll go to blend modes, and I'll just go down to hue. So you can see in here where there's no saturation at all, it's not applying any hues because there's no colors. If there's no colors, it can't apply any hue because it's looking for colors to apply its hue to. So with this blend layer, we'll just type in blend layer. With this blend layer here, this color, it's painting the hue of this green on all of the areas where there's color in this photograph, and it's replacing it with that color. However, you can see that it's not modifying the brightness or the saturation, it's strictly modifying the hue color. So what we can do here is I'll go over to my blend layer, I'll invert this, and now watch as I paint this on. And obviously, if you were trying to get it exact, you probably would go in there and zoom in and stuff and not try to get under arms. But just to give you guys an idea, I can remove this from our arms too. Cool. So now if we go over to that blend layer, turn this off and on, you can see how it's modifying those colors really, really easily by just replacing it with the hue of this blend layer. So it's not modifying anything other than the hue of this blend layer. There's no brightness modifications, it's not modifying the saturation, it's just bringing on the hue of this green onto the saturation or the colors of this base layer. So those are 3 more blending modes that I think you guys could use to make awesome photographs. I really appreciate everybody joining and watching. Thanks so much. Stay tuned for more ON1 live webinars, and have a great weekend, everybody.